Albert Camus once wrote that there is only one truly serious philosophical question, and that is the question of suicide. If life has no meaning, why go on living? That is not a provocative opening line. That is the logical conclusion of a worldview that Camus spent his entire career building and defending. He called it the philosophy of the absurd. And here is what makes Camus so interesting. He was honest. More honest, perhaps, than most philosophers who followed him. He looked into the void, acknowledged what he found there, and then tried to live anyway. You have to respect the consistency, even if you reject the conclusion. But two reformed Christian thinkers, Cornelius Van Til and Greg Banson, would argue that Camus never actually escaped the void. That his philosophy, for all its intellectual courage, was built on a foundation it could not justify, and that the very things Camus loved most, human dignity, solidarity, the revolt against meaninglessness, only make sense on Christian grounds. Welcome to Sovereign Reason. Let's walk through Camus carefully, and then let Van Til and Banson respond. Albert Camus was a French-Algerian philosopher and novelist who lived from 1913 to 1960. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957. His most famous works, The Stranger, The Myth of Sisyphus, and The Plague, all circle the same central problem. What do you do when you discover that the universe is utterly indifferent to human existence? Camus defined the absurd as the collision between two things. On one side is the human hunger for meaning, clarity, and purpose. On the other is the universe's complete silence in response to that hunger. We cry out for answers. The cosmos says nothing. That gap, that irreconcilable tension, is what Camus called the absurd. Now, Camus was clear that there are three possible responses to the absurd. The first is physical suicide, ending your life because it has no meaning. Camus rejected this as a cop-out. The second is what he called philosophical suicide, leaping into religion or ideology to manufacture meaning that isn't really there. Camus rejected this too, and he was specifically thinking of thinkers like Kierkegaard when he said it. The third option, Camus' own answer, is revolt. You acknowledge the absurd fully, you refuse to escape it, and you live defiantly in spite of it. You imagine Sisyphus, condemned to roll his boulder up the hill for eternity, and you imagine him happy. That is Camus' vision. It is bleak, it is brave, and according to Van Til and Banson, it is fundamentally incoherent. Cornelius Van Til was a Dutch-American Reformed theologian and philosopher who taught at Westminster Theological Seminary for decades. His central insight, the foundation of presuppositional apologetics, was this: every non-Christian worldview secretly borrows from the Christian worldview in order to function. Van Til called this borrowed capital. The idea is that secular philosophies cannot actually operate on their own terms. They need categories, like logic, like the reliability of human reason, like the existence of real moral values, that their own worldview cannot justify. They borrow these things from a Christian framework, and then pretend they own them. Applied to Camus, Van Til's question would be sharp and simple. On what basis does Camus condemn meaninglessness as something to be revolted against? Think about it. If the universe is truly silent, truly indifferent, truly without purpose, then why is meaninglessness a problem? Why does it feel like a wound? Why does Camus assume that human beings deserve meaning in the first place? The very fact that Camus experiences the absence of meaning as an outrage, as something intolerable, something worth writing hundreds of pages about, presupposes that meaning is something human beings are owed. But a truly indifferent universe owes us nothing. The sense that we deserve more than silence is itself a theological intuition. It is, in the language of Reformed theology, the image of God pressing against the walls of a godless philosophy. Camus feels the weight of the imago Dei. He just refuses to name it. Greg Banson was Van Til's most gifted student, and he sharpened these ideas into what he called the transcendental argument for the existence of God. The argument is not just that God exists. It is that the existence of God is the necessary precondition for anything being intelligible at all. Logic, science, morality, even the act of philosophical reasoning, none of these make sense in a universe without God. Banson would press Camus at exactly the point where Camus is most confident, his revolt. Camus says we should rebel against the absurd, that we should refuse to accept meaninglessness, that human solidarity and defiance have value. But Banson's question is devastating. Why? Why does revolt have value in an indifferent universe? Why is human solidarity meaningful if human beings are just a brief chemical accident on a cooling rock? Camus cannot answer this without stepping outside his own philosophy. The moment he says revolt is better than surrender, dignity is worth preserving, solidarity matters, he is making moral claims, and moral claims require a moral standard. A moral standard requires a moral lawgiver. Camus wants the fruit of the Christian tree while denying the roots. Banson would also point to the self-defeating nature of Camus's epistemology. Camus reasons carefully and logically to reach his conclusions. But logic itself presupposes that the universe is ordered, that rational thought tracks reality, that arguments can be valid or invalid. None of that is available in a universe that is fundamentally absurd and silent. If the universe truly has no rational structure, then Camus' own philosophical arguments have no foundation. He is using reason to argue that reason has no ultimate ground, and that is a contradiction he never resolved. Both Van Til and Banson would turn to Romans 1 at this point. Paul writes that the wrath of God is revealed against those who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, who know God through creation and conscience but hold that knowledge down, refusing to honor him as God. This is the reformed diagnosis of Camus. It is not that Camus was stupid, or that he did not think hard enough. It is that he was suppressing something he already knew. The outrage at meaninglessness, the hunger for justice, the love of beauty and human solidarity that runs through all of his writing. These are the fingerprints of a creator on a creature who is running from him. Camus' philosophy is not the honest face of a world without God. It is the anguished face of a man made for God who has decided he does not want him. That is a very different thing, and it is, ultimately, a more tragic thing. Camus gave us one of the most searingly honest portraits of life without God that philosophy has ever produced. He deserves to be read carefully and taken seriously, and the Reformed tradition does not dismiss him, it diagnoses him. Van Til and Banson would say, Camus, you were right that something is deeply wrong. You were right that the human hunger for meaning is real and serious. You were right that cheap answers are not good enough. Where you went wrong is in thinking that the hunger itself could exist in a world with no food. The very fact that you feel the absurd as a wound proves that you were made for something the absurd cannot provide. The Christian answer is not a leap into irrationality. It is not philosophical suicide, as Camus feared. It is the claim that the universe is not silent after all, that it has spoken, clearly and finally, in the person of Jesus Christ, and that the meaning Camus spent his life revolting for was available to him all along. That is the reformed response to the absurd, not a shrug, not a leap, a foundation. If this kind of thinking resonates with you, subscribe to Sovereign Reason. Next time, we will be looking at what Friedrich Nietzsche got right, and where Calvin's doctrine of God exposes the cracks in his philosophy. See you then.